All right, it is 12:30 Pacific time. I'm going to get started. We've got a few more people coming in. For all of our friends and family from around the world, this is not the center time zone of the universe. And so respecting all the different time zones, I've had the opportunity to travel in about 15 different countries. So if you're on that time zone shift, you're probably still a couple of days away from recovering. But again, my name is Jim O'Connell. I am from a small company called Verizon. If you have not heard of Verizon, we're a $200 billion company, and we're in 200 countries or so. We're a big monster company that does a lot of different things besides just sell cell phones and telephone service. And so we're going to raise a hand. Who here is from Verizon? I think I have awesome. Thank you for coming. Who here has a Verizon phone? All right, good. Who here has ever heard of Verizon? Great, we all have something in common. Great. Well, I'm going to talk about something that hopefully caught your attention from a title standpoint. So my normal day-to-day job is investigating criminal fraud. I can talk about that in a whole really long session. But when we kind of submitted, I submitted a fraud session, and I submitted this session. And I guess they said, well, you know, fraud is boring and this seems interesting. So we're going to go with this one. But if afterwards, if you do have some fraud questions, you can contact me, email me, Twitter, or whatever like that, and be glad to help out with that in that area. So we're going to talk about how we visualize, or how I visualize things, what we say, without numbers. And the idea here is really focusing on the visualization in your audience more than just the numbers itself. So I am testing out the story feature in Tableau. So we're going to see how this goes, because I was like normal people, typically used to PowerPoint. So because there's a lot of lawyers underneath me and over me in my company, I have a disclaimer. You can read that later. But the reality is, the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of me, the author, the presenter, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy and position of the author or the presenter's employer. And so I respect that. I love to tell my story about Verizon. I'm an old GTEer, if anybody's from that world, born and raised in Florida. And GTE became part of the Verizon family. My family has 76 years with the company. I have about 20 plus years, my brother 33 years, and my late father 25 years. So I know this company very well, back from, and I'll age myself, back from what we used to deal with and how we transmitted phone service via microwave towers, the original wireless, to stuff that we're doing now, which is pretty additionally amazing. So we're a big, amazing company and do a lot with analytics. So why listen to me? I've been doing security analytics for over 20 years, finding malicious hackers, fraudsters, and board insiders. I do have 10 patents and a bunch more pending. Majority revolve those around data analysis and user interface work of analytics. A number of years ago, when the big offshoring, outsourcing bubble come up around the 2004 timeframe, we were asked a lot about how to analyze whether we should go do offshoring in a country. And so we did one of the largest quantifiable country-by-country offshoring risk assessment, and this was completely done in Excel. Imagine it was about 100 countries and about 155 data points per country. Imagine doing all that, presenting it, and doing analytics around that to make somebody decide whether we do business in a country. I would love to have done that in Tableau now. Professionally and personally, I do use Tableau. I'm on Tableau Public, and I run Verizon's internal Tableau users group. For our friends in Verizon here, if you're not familiar with that, let me know, and we're trying to keep that moving forward. I love billion row data problems. I've actually asked data to talk to me or make it dance. But I do love large problems, generally because again, in my world, I'm looking for fraud. And sometimes I've literally seen massive amounts of fraud where you've had 1 million rows and 2 rows were identifiers of identification of fraud. Every company has fraud. Every NGO has fraud. And so it's just when you want to look for it. I have written an open source application. You'll actually see that. You'll be able to download it off of Tableau Public. I'm a blogger and a podcaster on building security departments, mainly around churches, NGOs, nonprofits, but it helps a lot of other people. I am not a sports fan, and I have nothing to do with Peyton Manning. So everybody says, doesn't that guy look like Peyton Manning? So a little bit of background on the first one. So this is kind of like, have you ever heard of lightning talks? This is kind of like 3 quick little lightning talks all in one. So the first one is around kind of a favorite subject when I'm not talking about security and fraud stuff, is around scope. And so the problems really are looking for solutions, not the other way around. So my boss is a former FBI guy, and the first time he came in, he says, they heard about him, they put out the press release, and they said, hey, Mr. Mason, we'd like to come see you. We're a vendor with some security wares. And he came in and he says, okay, you're a solution looking for a problem. And so I thought about that a lot, and I'm going, man, maybe we're doing analytics and a lot of these other things wrong. So a lot of times somebody will give us some data and say, find fraud. And I'm going, maybe it's a little backwards. So what we're doing now is we're saying, let's think about the ways that people could commit fraud and then figure out what data we need to find whether that's happening. And so then we go and find that. Now the challenge is, one of the challenges we have, like I'm sure a lot of y'all have, and strangely enough in the fraud world or the insider threat or just stupid process world, sometimes ask the right question and you get a very large answer. And so what happens? So one of the challenges we're running into right now, one of our biggest problems that can't unfortunately be solved by any of our friends in the vendor community downstairs, is how does the business deal with the volume of findings? So let's say I've got 100, the finance department got 2 or 3 fraud alerts a year. Well, what happens when I bring all that data into Tableau and I find 100? So that's one of the challenges we have, is how do we respond to this volume? So we deal with fraud theories. This is kind of where we kind of think of how the bad guy deals with it, things that we've seen in the past, things that we come in the future. We mainly look at insiders, employees, vendors, supply chain, and a little bit of customer fraud. So we just kind of sit around and do a lot of whiteboarding saying, how would I commit fraud? And then we use data to find that. We like finding bad people. And even though I are a certified auditor, auditors get mad at me for some these types of solutions. So first of all, we will declare just once that pie charts can actually be useful. And so you'll see this. In fact, let me get out my second prop here. I have version, like Tableau has kind of like version 1.0 of things. I have version 1.0 of my tool here. So I would walk around to folks, and I would go to get an auditor would walk in, or a project manager would walk in, or somebody would say, hey, here's a project we have. And they would say, what are we going to do? And I would say, let's define the scope. And I would take a simple pie chart. And it's something simple, and you can see it's kind of all marked up and stuff like that. But in reality is, this made a lot of people mad at us. Because we'd go in there and say, we're going to audit your financial system. Really? Which financial system? Oh, you have more than one? Duh, we're a $200 billion company. Okay? I think when we bought one company, there was like 33 billing systems. Okay, so which billing system are you going to audit? Okay, of that audit, what are you going to audit inside of there? Oh, transaction integrity. Which transactions? What's a scope statement? Well, what's a typical scope statement in a project or in an audit? We will evaluate the controls. We will implement such and such. Well, real ambiguous. And so we ran into, and so we pull out this pie chart all the time, and we'd start to cut out the slices. And the thing is, it wasn't the size of the slices initially, as you'll see in the presentation. It was really about what slices were covered and which weren't. And what was happening was the auditors would get to the end, and they would get to the end and say, here's all of our findings. Here's our 5 findings. Well, what's the assumptions of executives in a project? It's all covered. So there was only 5 findings. All other things were perfect and good shape. So scope development. First of all, it's all about scope and talking about project manager or auditors. First of all, Pamela Myers. If you've never heard of Pamela Myers, go to TED.com and look up Pamela Myers and watch her video about spotting liars. Great video. I've interacted with Pam in the past. So people are liars. People are deceptive. People are scared to define the full scope of their project. People are very naive. They think they have it all covered. Oh, well, the billing system. How many people have something called an enterprise data warehouse? How many can define the word enterprise? And Verizon, we actually had to write a white paper on the definition of enterprise. Because people were putting in their titles, people were putting it on their business cards, people putting it on data warehouses. Well, if it's an enterprise data warehouse, does that mean it have all the data? Odd. Well, I can tell you in Verizon, we have lots of enterprise data warehouses. Okay? That tells me the scope of all of them are very undefined. People are clueless. They don't know that something else out there exists. If you were to ask inside of Verizon how many business units there are in Verizon, you'll get a boatload of answers. There's 458, last count. Some people say there's Verizon Telecom, Verizon Wireless, Verizon something else. There's 457. Okay? Now, the reality is, so when somebody says, we're going to do a project, we're going to consolidate all the billing system of all of our business units. Well, which business units? Oh, you know, those two. Well, that's not all of them. People are human, and you can't stop hiring them. So we started out with this one. And I still use it to this day. I don't get to carry around Tableau all the time until that new Elastic project. That's pretty cool. My pastor says it great. The Greek, Hebrew, and English definition for all is all. And so how many times have we heard that inside of our own projects, audits, whatever you're working on? Version 2.0 is kind of this Flash, Excel kind of tool. This is a security-related version of it, and I'll show you here in a minute the new version of it. But the idea was we used a pie chart, and again, what you'll see is the slices over there, the size of the slide is not relevant. Thus, there's no numbers involved. So here's the 3.0. Here it is actually in Tableau. This is the dashboard version of it. So I'm going to try to go over live here to the individual. This doesn't go in easy order here. So what we did was we took a spreadsheet and we said, okay, let's talk about the scope of this project or this audit. So in this case, if you have any security background or an audit background, you've seen some of these terms. And so what we did is really simple, set up a spreadsheet. We set up a type of scope here, in scope, non-existent, out of scope, unknown. We had some filter here set up so we could filter that on and off. And then we had different scope categories. This can be anything. This can be, in a software development world, you could have, a feature set, a set of different sets of features, a cloud version versus an on-prem version. It could be different things like that. But the idea is to be able to checkbox it and modify the different pie charts. And the idea here is the focus is not on the size of the slice as a typical pie chart is. The focus is actually on the color. And the color here, in a telecom world, red is bad, green is good. There are only two colors in the telecom world. Because red is bad, network is down, wires are down, people die. Okay? Can't call 911. Okay? Green, executives are happy, SLAs are being made, and the FCC is happy. Oh, I didn't say that, sorry, my opinion. And so the reality is that the focus here is really around the visualization of the colors here. So if we go back, so what we did is we built a spreadsheet out, and again, this particular, the scope tool is out on Tableau Public, so you can go look for my name or scope technique, I think is how we called it out there. And so the idea here is, now, again, forgetting about the size of the slice, if I go into an executive, put this on a PowerPoint, the reality is it's very clear now what's in scope and out of scope. The red is out of scope. The green is in scope. The gray is non-existent. Okay, so you don't have a particular type of data, a particular type of environment. Or yellow, it's unknown. To be honest, in a development of scope, there is some unknowns. I don't know if there's more billing systems out there. I don't know, boss. So guess what? We're going to put that as an issue going out. But the idea is now when I go in there and I can take off the labels or whatever, I can go into the executive and say, listen, before the audit, before the project starts, here's what's in scope. Well, what's all those reds and those other colors? Shouldn't everything be green? Well, boss, we don't have enough time. We don't have enough resources. We don't have enough hours. And the idea here, again, it's not about the size of the slice. It's about the color. And so that's the focus of where we take scope development. So now I can go in there and say, you know what? We're not going to cover we're only going to cover availability. We're not going to cover integrity and confidentiality. We're not even sure if there's any mission critical, but we're going to cover non-mission critical, and there's no life or death issue because we're a 7-Eleven or something like that. And so, again, allows for communications very, very clearly based, again, on the colors. And again, all these is a simple spreadsheet of the different elements here, the individual elements down here. You see them status listing. This is basically the spreadsheet. You got the status, the scope category here, the scope area there, and then you've got the scope status. Now, the nice thing here, again, there's no numbers. It's all a 1. Let me see if I can pull up. For some reason, this order is not the best that I would have liked it. So one of the features that a lot of people don't know about is when you're doing, actually can't see it unless there we go. Most people don't know about is actually using text labels as your color. So this is actually the text label, so that's not a number, and it's actually driven over color, so it drives your colors based on that text label. And in the slice, it actually says slice size. The reality is Tableau needs something, and so the slice here comes back to be literally a number of 1s in the spreadsheet. And so the idea here is that you've got a label, but you're also using the color there. And again, I did a whole bunch of these across the board, scope category 1, 2, 3. And so using that for any purposes to be able to visualize the scope much easier. Let's see here. So here's just another format of it. Again, the scope categories. This is security, obviously, but it can be software development lifecycle. It could be a billing system. It could be a project management. The scope area, what are we going to cover? What features, not features, and then what's in and out. And again, being able to copy this into a PowerPoint, you can. Obviously, there's not a lot of dynamics to this, but it allows for very clarity. So there's basically the spreadsheet brought into a Tableau form. You've got the different in-scope, non-existent, and fill it out, and you see all the numbers. It's just a 1, so it establishes the pie slice. Okay, the next area is really around, one of the challenges that I had was because I'm kind of more focused on operational and fraud and investigations type of area, was I was always getting asked about status of my projects. And I wanted it to be data driven. And so we also ran into a lot of issues of who supports who inside of a project, so roles and responsibilities. So, and my boss wanted really some bottom line thinking. Well, I had learned a little bit about SharePoint, but didn't have a lot of time for it, was not going to run these things through Microsoft Project, because again, I wanted to get it back to the fraudsters. I didn't want to do project management, to be honest. And so didn't have a lot of time for Microsoft Project, didn't have a lot of SharePoint expertise, but they wanted an immediate status, data-driven status on different projects that I was working on. So that, added to me as a lazy PM, converted to executive managers are very color influenced. So what we did here is, again, very similar. We took here, and here's the project here. Here's different phases across there. So a controls phase, a customer visit phase, an IT work phase, a marketing integration, monitoring, on-site work, operations, website, could be anything you want. And again, same thing here. The size or the slice obviously is irrelevant here. And the idea here is we've got just a simple Tableau worksheet that I can tooltip over. I can actually put in a status description. There you see it says not started. I can tooltip in a full status of text there. And the idea is, again, the text, the actual icon color comes from fields that are actual words in that status description. So operationally and verified, in progress, issues exist, or not started. Here we have a different way of looking at it from a project management. You got maybe different phases, but the idea here, the same way, you've got an environment where you can very quickly take this and say, here's the stat. Again, all can be data driven. All I've got to do is have somebody go in and update a spreadsheet with those statuses over on the right-hand side. They can have that as a drop-down in the spreadsheet, or we actually used a SharePoint list, pulled this data right out of that SharePoint list, so they can drop down, do all their stuff in SharePoint. We brought that over through through one of the data connectors and be able to publish it up like this. The nice thing is we did it the opposite. We then, when we pulled that off of the SharePoint list, provided the status as you see it here in Tableau, we actually then published this up to the SharePoint server, and then had, Tableau server, published it up to Tableau server, and then in SharePoint, we took a web part and asked it to pull in the SharePoint web part from Tableau server. So it was a 360 thing where we got the status from SharePoint, did the viz in Tableau, and then published it back out, so SharePoint. So the executors are sitting there in SharePoint, and they don't realize there's a back-end analytics going on that's actually very dynamic. So they can actually, in SharePoint, because it's a web part, they can sit there and highlight over it, or they can, if I built in filters, I would have had that there. But it's right built in, and they don't see the difference. And so again, same thing here, where we're looking at the colors and not the numbers using the status, so I can give somebody a quick status. Here's the project, here's the different phases. They can see the status very quickly. And if they have questions, we can add in some detail into those through tooltips or something like that. The next area is a little bit hard because it's a larger viz, but it's a similar thing. And so one of the things we ran into was who supports who. And so, Verizon has certain organizations that are centralized, say real estate, let's think of something else, sourcing for purchasing. A lot of those things are more centralized than Verizon. But there's other functions that are not as centralized. There's certain areas of security that I work in that are not centralized. And a lot of people say, is all of those areas covered? Who supports who? And so we also did a data-driven based on roles and responsibilities so that people can, again, see dynamically, they can see very quickly on a single chart, not only who supports who, so Mr. Chester supports Mr. Arnie here, and then you can take in here, this is a better example down there with two color. So here's Mr. Jake supports Mr. Becker in different areas. So we got pre-production, pre-coding, different things like that. So you can have a pie chart. Again, the size and the number is not relevant, but the idea is the color can pick up on the different areas so they can do a matrix. So you heard about matrix roles and responsibilities. So again, very simplistic, simple spreadsheet that's out there so that you can set up, hey, what are the areas of responsibility? Who are they supporting across the top? Obviously, that can be switched. And then within each of the blocks, what are they supported for? So you take security. Maybe Mr. Jakes only supports Mr. Arnie in one particular area of security, but Mr. Heath supports Mr. Bach in 12 different areas. You can all display that, again, using simple pie charts and based on the color and the size being, again, irrelevant. Here's another way to look at the same thing. The organization, who they're supporting, and the different areas, compliance, coding, internal network, pre-production, production support. And so you can see where there's potential gaps. If there's no line going across here, if there's no dot across here, someone says, hey, who's supporting Mr. Schneider, for production support? I don't know. So you can see gaps. So conceptually, boxes should be kind of all, every particular area should be covered by somebody. And the idea is to visually be able to pick this up very, very quickly. So the last area, check my time here. Good. Okay. So last area is what we honor the Tableau feature of the year. One of my new favorite features is this, not that they necessarily programmed it this way, but I love the feature called Null. I don't even think they call it a feature. It's just kind of a label type thing. But in the security world, and particularly in the audit world, we're always generally looking at confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And for the ones outside the United States, that stands for the CIA. Okay, so the CIA and me, we really focus on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It's what's drilled into security people, drilled into auditors all the time. All of our training, all of our certifications drive into confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The reality is most auditors and most security professionals and even most IT folks, compliance folks, very, very focused on availability. Why? Because without availability, at least in the telco world, people die. Okay, so availability is kind of important. Systems are down, etc. So confidentiality, yeah, it's a little bit more when you got PCI and healthcare information. So healthcare is kind of number 2 on the IT list type thing. But where's that integrity thing come in? Well, I was sitting here and doing some fraud analysis of a particular data set, and I'm, of course, a big advocate for scope. I love the feature. If you don't use the feature, love the feature in Tableau called caption. You should have that on like every slide. I know it takes a little bit of text, but it's a fantastic feature because what does it tell you? It tells the audience what is included and potentially what is not included, okay? And so I'm going through this, and all of a sudden I go, so what was the typical response when I would go through a bunch of data? Clear out the stuff that was blank and clear out the stuff that was null. Immediately filter that out because that was the long line on the bar chart. Well, let's go back to my slide where I was talking about before. Am I lying to my audience? Am I deceptive to my audience? But I don't do that. It's kind of like including, not including something in scope when in reality it's there. So I just don't tell them it's in scope. Okay. Again, I'm not calling everybody a liar. I'll leave that up to Pamela Myers. So, but my Post-it moment, if you're familiar with the story behind Post-it notes, was the guy was in the lab kind of making a mistake. Some glue fell on some paper and went, wow, this is cool, and made some Post-it notes. My Post-it note was really around this concept of null. And so what we would do is we were going through a bunch of data, and all of a sudden I said, let me take a whole bunch of this data that I've done some fraud analysis on. Let me copy those workbooks. And instead of selecting all and unselecting the blanks and the nulls, let me do the same analysis with the null and the blank turned on. And it was just this aha moment. And it was all this data that was critical data. So big in the fraud world is address, location, location, location. For the people that are familiar with the IT world, I can't shoot, fire, or discipline an IP address. Okay? But I can shoot, fire, or discipline a human being. And so the idea is that location, location, location. And so the idea is if I don't have that location, if the location field in a database is blank, again, what's the typical response? I'm going to filter it out. Well, the reality is, let's say I have a number of records that don't have that location field filled in. The problem is I may be missing some fraud. Or I may be producing a dashboard or a workbook, again, that may be somewhat deceptive. If I don't tell my audience, hey, by the way, you have a whole bunch of field. And I'll show you an example of that here in a minute. So while searching for fraud, discovered integrity issues in the data. And the reality is it was so easy. And so a lot of times I will do if I'm doing an analytics for somebody, a lot of times I will go in there and say, before I get started, let me explain two things. Number one, are you ready for the results? Are you ready to respond to the volume of results that we're going to find? If you're not, I'm not going to do analytics because I'm going to deceive you and I'm going to know something that I shouldn't have known before. Number two is, are you ready to fix what I may find that's a process issue? Because if I find a whole bunch of records that are blank, that may involve some human being going back and typing in 6,000 records. Okay? So if they're not prepared for that and that scope, because I'm going to cover the whole scope, okay? If they're not prepared for that, I may not want to do the analytics. So, but again, as executives, ready for the findings. So what Null told me, you have a scope problem. Did a couple analysis, 90,000 records transactions, 7,700 or so didn't have a person identifier. Don't have a person identifier, can't do much with it. 19,000 records didn't have a company identifier, and 72,000 records had a description of other or unknown. Okay, not very helpful. 40,000, same kind of problem. We had a null, and we had 0, 0, 0, 0, or none. We looked up about 12,000 of those records that were updated before 1/1/2014, and the reality is they were actually supposed to be updated on a weekly basis. And Superstore is not the norm for my Tableau people in the room. It has very little integrity issues. That's not the norm. There are no nulls. I actually checked. Okay? So Jim, what's with all the numbers? So here's an example where we took a data set. I'll give you a fraud tip if you're really interested in going looking at a particular set of fraud. Go look at people that remote access into your network. I'll leave it at that if you have some more questions about that later on. So this is looking at people remote access in our network. No big deal. The idea that's irrelevant of what the type of data is. You'll see on here the columns is date and time. The rows is purely the number of records. So the issue is not about VPN. The issue here is about data integrity. Okay. So here's the first way it looks up. Fires up. This is particular. It normally starts at year. I did it by month. Fires up. Looks normal. You know, got some dips, got some spikes. Odd things here. let's, if I break it down, if you're not familiar with it, in Tableau, there's a little button over here that has a little plus sign. Great little feature there. You click on that little button and it takes you to a week. If you see it up there in the upper right-hand corner, it takes you to a week. And so we say, oh, you know, we see a couple little things here, but, okay, whatever. Okay, the reality is when we went down, sorry, it cut off here because of how it's doing. But the reality is I actually went down, even though the data is not down to the second, I actually clicked that button to tell Tableau to go as far deep into the data as it could. It's hard to see here. Let me see if I can get it to, yeah, there we go. So actually what this little spike here becomes that little drop there, becomes that little drop there. It's 24 days of missing data. There's about 375,000 records. But if you're just looking at this and, quote, looking at it as a trend line, you're not going to see it. So here was one, basically one, that was just missing records. Then if you go into, again, setting up things around Null, you can find not just missing records, but now missing data. So let's see if that, or if you don't like any of those, you can use data to make Tableau draw for you. And just go. That's actually a data-driven target. Does this stuff work? Absolutely. So I use it a lot, again, when I'm trying to explain to people what's covered and not covered in a particular area. I was over in the Philippines one time, did a demonstration, did a talk on scope development for some project managers and auditors and fraud investigators. And a guy came up to me one time and he says, Jim, I don't like your tool. I said, why? He says, because if I start to use it, it'll show that I've been lying and deceptive to my boss. Well, who's your boss? A certain government. Okay, it's a problem. I've had auditors come in and says, you can't use that tool. That'll show all the areas we're not covering. Well, you know, what happened to deceptiveness and ethics and all those things? The reality is we don't have enough time to cover everything we need to do. So what we do is we step back and say, you know what, let's cover what we're going to cover. And if you go to, if you're anybody here is, anybody in here a PMP, project management professional? Awesome. I failed the test twice. Working on it. Okay, good luck. But what's the definition of scope? What's included and what's not included. It's in the definition of project management. Okay? And so we're not putting in that what's not included. So when you're doing any kind of viz, again, whether you're using caption or some note or something like that, you really got to make sure that you're there. So I'm going to show off to my son. My son is an amazing son, 17 years old, and he likes to make Tableau logos. Did I face that right? And if you have any information, if you know that Tableau is a big Lego fan, and so there you go. And if you have contact information out of Lego also, there's my QR code for my contact information if you're wondering. There I am. You can email me. This is my personal blog and website, securitydepartmentdesign.com. There's my Twitter account. If you looked on the app, it may have had my old Twitter account, but it'll point to the two. And if you need questions, scan the QR code and you'll go to my website or meet me outside. That's about 3,000 Legos done for a tiger drawing there, but kind of showing off my son there since he puts up with all my numbers discussions that I have going on. And so I'll leave it at that. Hopefully that was helpful and valuable to you. There is a survey on the app. Please fill that out. 1 through 5 or something like that. 3 simple questions. Hope it's valuable. I'll open up to any questions about what we talked about here, or if you have some fraud or security questions, you can tweet me or catch me afterwards, but I'll open it up, and thank you for your time.